Hello and welcome to AngularAir. My name is Jeff Welpley. I am your host today, and we have a wonderful show in store for you today talking about creating UI libraries with Angular 2. It's a topic that I think most people that are starting to build Angular 2 apps for their company are starting to run into this particular kind of challenge, and we have a number of people on the panel today that are going to give some great insights. Before I get to that, though, I just want to mention we have been plugging the past month about John Papa and Dan Whalen's 2-day intensive training course in Fort Lauderdale, which is going to be awesome. And it was supposed to be in the beginning of October, but then the hurricane hit. So just a heads up that it is still on. They moved it to November 4th and 5th. So if you are going to be in the area and Fort Lauderdale area, or you want to make a trip out of it, this is going to be a really awesome course, and you should definitely check it out. Go to ng-learn.com. Okay, on the panel today, we have Dimitri. No, he's silent right now, and Justin Schwarzenberger.
Hey, how's it going?
And then Wesley Cho.
Hello.
And then our special guest today, who has the first time on the show, is Kyle Ledbetter.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
So Kyle, you haven't been on the show before. Why don't you give us kind of an introduction to yourself and let us know a little bit about your background and your interest in UI libraries with Angular 2.
Yeah, great. So I am currently the UX architect and kind of like UX director at Teradata. Teradata was traditionally a big hardware company, multi-million-dollar appliances, but we're doubling down in the cloud space and open source. So I came up in other companies like eBay and Sears and in open source, and have loved Angular since the early days. And we jumped on Angular 2 as soon as we went to ngConf. And now we're building a massive open source UI platform on top of Angular 2 and Angular 2 material.
Very cool. And we're definitely going to dive into the details of that and just UI libraries in general. But I want to continue to go around the panel and kind of get the experience or what the interest level or the angle that the rest of you guys here today are coming out of how you work with UI libraries today, what you've done in the past. Wesley, let's start with you.
Yes, I'm currently a lead engineer at a company called MindFlash. Our product is a LMS, and I'm also heavily involved in the Angular ecosystem. Not as much in 2 yet, although we started using it on my team, and so I'm hoping to actually open source drag and drop library at some point. And I'm involved with UI Bootstrap in particular, as well as ng Bootstrap, the Angular 2 successor to that project.
Cool. Thanks, Wesley. Justin, how about you?
Yeah, I'm a lead engineer at SoCreate. We're developing a screenwriting platform and using Angular 2. And we really do a lot of stuff with thinking about UI libraries internally for our application. So like these global component concepts where we have these reusable components that live in the kind of like a global space, yet we want to use throughout our app and implement sort of thing. So thinking about not so much of a redistribution of those, but a use of those with that same kind of distribution kind of pattern.
Cool. Dimitri, how about you? We cannot hear you, Dimitri. Oh, no. All right, so jump off, Dimitri, and once you join back, you can fill in or whatever. Try Safari. Okay. For me, so I human, and we are in the process of building a number of new apps, and this is like a topic that's close to my heart right now because we are actually trying to figure out the best way, sort of like Justin is talking about, the best way to share UI components among different apps. Dimitri, are you back on?
No.
No. All right. Okay, try again in a little bit. Okay, so let's dive into the topic here. Kyle, just sharing modules, like creating a module that has code in it, utility code or whatever, is pretty straightforward. Like, especially if it's like a standard node library, you have your JavaScript and your package JSON, and you publish it to NPM, and that's pretty much it. So what's the difference here? Like, what are the complexities, the challenges that you deal with whenever you are trying to have a library that has UI components?
Yeah, so at our company, we probably have like 25 different product teams right now working on this stuff across the globe, different time zones. So we need reusable components. So the hard part is deciding which ones, first of all, should be in the platform. It's got to be stuff that's really reusable, that everybody needs, that's abstracted enough that everybody can use it for their potential usage. But they always make, the way we upstream it is you make a local one in your app, something that's reusable across your app that you don't want to duplicate code. But then you decide, should everybody get this? So they open a pull request. We have kind of like a round table in Slack, and we decide if it needs to be put into the platform. The hard parts are then making it to where it's easy to theme with local SAS variables. Does this belong in the core platform, or should it be its own NPM module? We always have these back and forth, and they're really just long discussions, and then we come to a vote, essentially. We like to put as many things in the core that we think everybody will use, just like you can pull down the whole Angular package or the whole Angular material package by itself. But then, yeah, there's always a debate back and forth, what should be individual and what deserves to be in the platform.
Yeah, so what are some of the criteria that you use? Is it just a matter that multiple things are trying to use that component that you split it out, or is there some other criteria you use as well?
Well, the funny thing is that we use pretty simple criteria. We use GitHub issues and thumb up icons on the voting of the things that people want to get into the platform. And if it just seems like a lot of teams want to use it, and then we give it a hard critique to see if they're properly styling the thing. Does it adhere to the material design spec as good as it should? And is it following all the code styles that are suggested for Angular and kind of fit into our platform? So yeah, it's really just letting the people vote on if they want it. And if they do, then we just make sure we tick all the boxes if it fits into our platform properly.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple things there. Like, let's start off with CSS, because, you know, let's say you are splitting it out to its own library, and there is a style component. Actually, so there is an element that the component itself may have styles specific to that component, like positional based styles, let's say. But then there also may be contextual styles that, however you use that component, styles have to be applied into it a certain way, and that may affect how you kind of build that component. So what are some of the guidelines that you use, or you know, issues that you kind of run into around that area of how to best deal with styles for a particular component that you are sharing in a library?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a challenging thing. So we just had a pull request from an outside team, our first kind of massive pull request, and it was a data table. And if you've ever built one, those things are complicated. They kind of included all their own CSS in there, and they did everything in the pull request. And we worked back and forth with them and collaborated in the code review to say, hey, we actually have the Flexbox layouts from Angular Material 1. So they're included in the core of our thing. You don't need to do this position placement. You could just use the layouts and the flexes and things like that. And then they had their own colors and styles. And I said, hey, you can actually import the Angular Material theme that they finally released in Angular Material 2. And you can style your things to where a user can simply change one set of SAS variables in their style, not only the app, but your data table. So everything matches perfectly. Things like that. You know, the icons, we include the ligatures for the material design icons. So we said, you don't need to import that. You can just use MD icon and just use the name there. So really just going down the list of things that don't need to be included that make it more dynamic so it plugs right into the platform.
I think this is also just a difficult problem in general because it depends on the, I guess, what are the libraries that are backing the library, the UI library that you're building. For example, I mean, like I'm involved with ng Bootstrap, and we have to actually rely on the CSS cascading from Bootstrap because so we can't package the components as, for example, using true web components with Shadow DOM and all that. We have to use Angular's virtual Shadow DOM, for example, let it cascade and use appropriate classes so that users can override it very easily. So you have to be careful about avoiding being too opinionated, I feel like, if you want to bundle libraries for reuse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I do think that's one of the interesting differences now between like something that was traditionally as cascading as Bootstrap CSS versus the way things are kind of being built now with like Angular Material 2. It's absolutely opinionated because it's bundled with the design spec. You're not really supposed to deviate from that, whereas Bootstrap doesn't come with one and you have to add styles on top of it. So it's an interesting difference between the two. I like it to be as easy as possible, and so people can't break it across the company, people that I've never even met. So yeah, we like to where they could just change some SAS variables and the whole thing changes appearance, but it still strictly adheres to the opinionated styles that we have. I actually think that's the difference between Angular 1 and 2. Angular 1 was more of an opinionated framework, and Angular 2 is more of an unopinionated platform. So we're adding our opinions in our own UI library on top of their platform, basically.
I think things get really challenging too when you start talking about whether you're doing content transclusion and whether you have ng content in these components or not. You know, if your component is the end of it, then styling is a little bit more straightforward. But as soon as you've got a component where you want to allow other components inside of it, now how do you scope your CSS and stuff in a Shadow DOM sort of way to allow you to style that particular theme and theme that particular component, yet let whatever parent component's putting stuff inside of it still control its children?
Shadow DOM is nuts. It's awesome. It's the thing we've always wanted. Justin, I watched your talk at ngConf, and it finally got me to dive in. I had been following it from Polymer ever since its beginning, and I finally said, okay, now's the time. But yeah, you've got the different view encapsulations now. So Angular Material turned it off, and we have it on all of our stuff. So figuring out when you need to get into the DOM tree, when you need to go host deep and all this craziness to try to get down to style an element or override it can be very confusing, and we're still learning, really.
But in general, am I hearing correctly that the specific way that we're talking about, that as far as the best practice goes for adding styles would be, within the component, decorator, like at the style attribute there, adding your classes so that you use the view encapsulation, the Shadow DOM emulation, so that you define those styles and then they appear for that, scoped for that component. Is that what you guys are advocating, or Kyle, am I not gathering that correctly? Is there something different that you guys do?
No, you're pretty spot on. What I tell a lot of teams is if you find yourself writing a lot of CSS, you're probably doing something wrong. We have everything's bundled so nicely, and that's why I like the encapsulation of Angular 2, that our components already have everything they need. Beyond doing the SAS variables, I could see doing on a component view a couple of kind of like style overrides, and it's nice that it will only apply to that one component view. Everything's components, so it gets hairy, but I think that's a good use of Shadow DOM. If you want to nudge a couple things over just for the one dashboard view, just do it in the Shadow DOM for that one view so it doesn't bleed into everything else unless you want it to, right?
One of the things that we've approached is there's several scenarios that come up. Like you say, okay, I want this component to be able to have its style kind of or theme kind of dictated from its implementation. So you've got this other component that's going to use this component. You can do things like provide a CSS class that you put on the host of that element, and then or that component, and then that component can do a host context selector or host selector and say, hey, if I've got this class on me, I'm going to do these styles versus those styles, right? And then also looking at things like you talk about like Sass variables, Sass mixins potentially for bringing some of that stuff in, but then also just CSS properties and stuff like that. And there's so many different pieces to try and solve that puzzle of that you could potentially do. Like that's when things get really kind of tricky of like, how do you allow somebody to style this thing, yet also allow that to flow through still, and be configurable.
I found one that blew my mind yesterday, actually. I was trying to teach a team. We were using the menu in Angular Material 2. And being a platform, they reuse things like the overlays now. It's actually all separated so it can be abstracted. I didn't realize the drop-down menu renders outside of the parent component. It was in the DOM tree. And I was trying to cascade it with Shadow DOM. And then I finally realized, oh, this thing's by itself in the DOM tree. So we had to go to traditional CSS from the top of the body, basically. So it's weird. I mean, things are complex. There's probably 15 different ways you can style something now.
So is there ever time that you would put the styles in a separate CSS, SCSS, whatever file outside of the actual component, like outside of the actual TypeScript file that has your component? And if so, like how is that effectively shared? Because like by its nature, if you do that, then you're requiring the user of that library to actually have some sort of extra build step or something that hooks into their build to grab that external CSS file, right?
In Angular Material 2, they released 2 new files at the root of your doc. There's a styles.sass and there's a themes or theme.sass. The style, they're both automatically compiled and included. The theme is just for the variables. The styles just acts like traditional compiled CSS. So that's where we kind of throw our general stuff, and then everything else goes in the specific component Sass.
Okay, so then in that case, you would expect someone using that library, just like that'd be part of using it, that you have to include that CSS file in your build, right?
Yeah, well, like I said, for us, we generally say only add stuff if you need to. That style.css is really only for their app usage, so it's empty when they get it. So they can put things in there that they need specifically for their app that they're not going to upstream back to the platform. And then everything else is just component to component. So, but you shouldn't have to go actually like include these things in the build. They're automatically built for you.
Okay. To what degree do, like sometimes, and this maybe goes beyond just styles, and maybe starts branching out into some of the other parts of UI library, like for state management. So like, we talked a little bit about the theming that goes on and like when the parent style kind of influences what the actual shared component style is. But I guess even taking that out further for state, like, so when you're dealing with state, is there any best practices that you follow for how you manage the state of the parent interacting with the state of the component?
Yeah, well, this is all really component to component for us, or component view to component view. We follow all the best practices that Angular 2 is providing us now. We're trying to really stick to the standards so anybody can come off the streets and use our stuff. So we separate out things like services when we can and all the API calls, stuff like that, right? But once we get to a component view, all the logic really lies in there. And you have to be very deliberate with TypeScript and with ES6 and with Angular 2 about what you want to do, what variables you're defining and where you're going to use them. We had to add some extra HTTP interceptors on top of what you get in Angular 2 to try to make some of our CRUD work how we wanted to. Because it's very, very opinionated and specific, I would say. That's the one part that is specific. You've got to intentionally create those functions, and it won't bleed unless you try hard for it to bleed.
So as a general rule, it sounds like, oh, go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges in that is looking at going, okay, I'm building these components that are going to be reusable. Do I take the approach of using inputs and outputs, and that's just what they rely on? Or do I commit to constructor injection? And when you really commit to constructor injection, at that point, it becomes more complicated for somebody to consume and implement your component, right? There's this dependency now that the parent component or somewhere up the stream has to provide that constructor injected stuff for it to work. Whereas if you have an inputs and outputs decorators, right, somebody could just put that markup in there and specify in the markup what they're going to provide to that component, and you're kind of off and running.
Justin, for the constructor injection, are you just referring to using a service that like the parent has to implement?
Yeah, so like let's say you're creating a component and we're talking about state, right? And you're like, okay, I'm going to hand state data to my component via an input. Well, that's pretty straightforward because now I can use that, implement that component and just put it in the markup and hand it some, template syntax stuff. But now if that component is expecting to receive that through constructor injection, now my parent component up the tree somewhere has to be providing that service, that whatever you're getting into. And now that component, if that component's reaching into that to get its state and work with its state.
I think in general, you want to stick with inputs and outputs and only use stuff like with where you're injecting something and using a service if you explicitly want to do something imperative, like maybe a modal or something like that. Because if you want it reusable, then you want to have you want to keep your component like as agnostic to the state of a person's application as possible. And as soon as you're doing injection, you are actually introducing some sort of stateful mechanism into it. So you can go down a very deep rabbit hole doing that. So you have to be very careful. And if you're going to do injection, it should generally be only with like maybe helper services or something like that, that your module is providing if you're building something for reuse.
Completely nailed it. I don't think I have anything else to add to that. That's what we've been doing. For all of our usable stuff, we use inputs and outputs. And just for those kind of uses is when we do the injection. So yeah, nailed it.
Yeah, I guess another way I've heard that being said is the idea of the dumb components, right? That like your library, all your components should be dumb and like allow the parent container to do all of the, define how you do all of the like event handling and setting of values and all of that. So that totally makes sense. Yes.
And I would like to add that actually this pattern is already like possible in Angular 1, and it probably is the way to go when you're doing stuff and creating reusable stuff in Angular 1 as well. You just have different names instead of like using all the various isolate scope bindings. You're using inputs and outputs. And if you want a service to inject, you can inject it in directives too, like in Angular 1. So I mean, like there's very strong parallels to how you would do it in Angular 1 and Angular 2.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the build process, because I feel like this, maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like it gets complicated. What is the best practices for when you want to publish a library, and how you, I guess, A, what do you pre-build before you publish, and then B, what do you do in order to make sure that what you're publishing fits in well with the build system of the person who's using your library?
I would say the first thing you need to, before publishing your next version, is pray a bit that all steps will go fine, because you need like TypeScript, then ECMAScript 6, and you need CommonJS style and build UMD files and check it works with ahead of time compilation and it will not fail on universal. And then you have to check that all of this works in, for example, Explorer 9. So a bit of drink and small pray usually helps. It's like a good step on pre-publish npm hook.
Dimitri, what's going on with that facial hair there? You've been in the show for a little while. That is extremely interesting. It's awesome. I've not seen that one before. So. What do you call that?
I call it my shaver is broken. I'm too lazy to buy a new one.
Okay. Anyways, sorry, I had to comment. So, Kyle, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, it makes me want to drink too. It's been the most interesting thing, with following all the RC updates up to stable for Angular. We were trying to do everything they were doing, and they kept changing at the last minute for good reasons, but it was painful. So we always try to mimic whatever they were doing with a little bit of blend of Angular Material 2. They have some extra build steps for the way they have to, like bringing in gulp for certain SAS things. So So yeah, like there's a difference between our platform build and like we also have like an example app. So we're always trying to do both, where we have all the UMD stuff, all the packages and modules all ready to go, and then we have the complexity of deciding if we want it in the core of the npm modules versus the single npm modules. It's a complicated build process, and we also like to ship our SaaS uncompiled too with our things, so we have to move those files in the right places. Yeah, I drink too, so that's all I can
What
say.
about for ahead of time compilation, NGC? Is that something that is typically run before you publish? So you publish the sort of artifacts that get generated from that?
We do a little both. We're not doing a ton of real AOT stuff right now. It was more just theoretical for us, just waiting for real implementations. We're just now kind of delving into what we could do in that space. But yeah, like we try to stick to the ng build stuff, the built-in Angular CLI stuff when we can, but you've got to add stuff on top of it to move files into place. The last thing we're going to do that we haven't done on our end, we want to ship the minified CSS. So you can do stuff like just like Plunker examples and all that, right? We don't currently have all that built. You have to add the Angular CLI for our stuff right now, and Webpack.
So do you, these host projects that you set up for where you develop these components, are you doing that with the Angular CLI, creating a new project, using that as your host? And then how's that process for, as you work on these samples of, you actually writing the code for the components, yet not really having another app that, or maybe you do have another app that actually is implementing and using them so you can see it in that example?
Yeah, we do a lot of upstreaming. So we're building the platform while my team directly builds 3 other products at Teradata. So we're often dog fooding it, and a lot of times we build it local to that app first, and then we turn back around and try to abstract it and upstream it back into Covalent. But yeah, it can go either way. Sometimes we know we're going to need it, so we have a married platform app and an actual app using it in our repo, so we can directly dog food it and document it while we're building it. So I begged for that with the team. They wanted to separate it, but I was like, if we don't have the docs app with the platform app, we're never going to know what's going on.
So generally speaking, are all you guys just publishing your components for the browser for the client side, or are you also doing server side? Are you doing other platforms as well? I mean, obviously Angular 2 has this sort of multi-platform capabilities so that you can do Electron, NativeScript, Ionic, all this different stuff. Is that something that you guys generally care about? I can say from my standpoint, I haven't gotten far enough to, like, actually with our development to have something working, but the thing that we're trying to prototype are components actually the same component used for browser, server, mobile. And I'm only starting to scratch the surface on the sort of complexities involved in trying to do that. So I'd be interested if any of you guys have tried to do that as well.
So I was lucky to grab a project which involves NativeScript and web stuff. So, and it was at the first initially it was pretty hard to be platform agnostic a bit, because not everything works the same way, and then you have to produce more like MVM construction where your template and controller, actually component being it, is dependent on the platform you use. Because for NativeScript, you have different inputs, outputs, almost, and different bindings to template inside of it. If you do it for web, it's different again. So it's not about just like replacing templates. It's more like replacing templates, replacing bindings inside of it to the component, and more with you have a different animation for your mobile device, because then it goes like swipe left, swipe right. They have a bit different intentions and just go back, go forward. So we are working on things like just like dynamic component inclusion. But if you will take a look on Advanced Angular 2 seed, it's pretty nice because it's replaced template, but we have to go a bit forward and replace the component itself. So it's tricky part, but most probably I will be like to show some samples to the world in the nearest future, because this is the way how it will be most probably. You will just replacing template with different things. It's not enough usually, but it works. And it works for native, it works for web and universal. Your brain is boiling, but I was thinking about this thing, and I had a similar application like 5 years ago. I was .NET developer and just started my AngularJS trip. And at that point, this was simply not possible with any frameworks available at that point. But right now, thanks to Angular 2, it became actually possible. So it's awesome.
That's awesome. That's a completely different experience than we're having right now, and I'm kind of jealous of some of the things you just said. We're currently, we ship our things in Docker containers for all of our products. So they're nice because they're immutable. They're all self-contained and have everything they need, and they can't break really. All of our products have a ton of Docker containers, and we use Kubernetes to orchestrate it. So we'll deploy that out to AWS or onto a customer site on their own internal cloud. It's kind of wherever you want to host the Docker containers for us. We just hired a guy that came from React and an Electron guy. So now I'm excited to bring in Electron to the fold. And it's really a toy right now. I mean, we've got desktop apps at Teradata, but I'm excited to see what we can do and what's possible. And then we'll figure out what we really need to be doing with the desktop.
Cool. Yeah, I guess for the stuff that we're working on, I mean, I am interested to see whether this is going to work out the way that I kind of envision. But the way I think about it is the service level, so the non-UI level. So take UI out of it for a second. Multi-platform is like right in the wheelhouse of the way that Angular 2 is set up, because you can use DI, you can switch out the actual implementation of a particular service so that the platform-specific versions, whether it's on the server or in browser or Electron or whatever, or on the mobile device, is used instead of some common interface. So that's easy, but it gets harder at the UI level for some of the stuff that Dimitri mentioned, where it can get tricky. Sometimes the behavior is different. Sometimes there's stuff that just doesn't work, and you can't, at least currently, use DI to change out the kind of components. So I guess the thing that starting to look at it, which I'd be interested to see if any of you guys have done this before, but rely more on like the Webpack kind of build side of, because through Webpack you can switch out files, switch out components. So use that as like if you can't create a common way of having like a template that works in all areas, then at the very least, different UI, 2 different files for that component. You kind of split it there and use, just as part of your build process, switch out one for the other, since you don't have DI at your disposal. Have any of you guys tried to do that?
I don't have a ton of experience, but swapping out components for different OSs makes me feel eerily like the back in the days when we used to have IE-only CSS. That just scares me, man. I want to have something that works everywhere.
Okay. Maybe I'm just insane with that. So we'll see. Okay. So let's move on for, okay, so for publishing to NPM, we talked a little bit about some of the build related stuff that goes on there. Is there anything else that's critical that you guys see that needs to be included in your package when you're publishing, other than the stuff you kind of already talked about, the artifacts? What about like documentation? Like, how do you guys handle documentation when you release for your components?
For our stuff, we ship the platform documentation on the same place where we push the actual platform. We have a GitHub Pages build. Honestly, I don't even know if the ng GitHub Pages build works now. We wrote our own while we were working or waiting for that one to work again. It might work. But we wrote a little Angular 2 Markdown processing thing too. So for docs, we'll just write a lot of Markdown docs in Angular and ship it in an Angular app. And we also do the README docs that you have to with GitHub now. It's kind of the standard for all your components.
So for us, and we're not really building components that we're exposing out for other applications, but more for our internal, but these global component concepts. One of the things we approached was how can we kind of ensure that people document the usage of these things so that we have that ongoing and living, right? So we actually kind of went a little bit to an extreme and did some stuff like added some audits and stuff like that that would confirm that we have documentation in place, almost like unit test to confirm that we do have documentation to go along with this global component, all the way down to the SAS level that we have SAS variables and SAS mixins, and that we actually identify that they are used somewhere, and that we have some documentation explaining how to use them. And so we have this kind of a unit test type check to make sure. And then when we develop these components, one of the jobs is, as you develop a component, is to also keep the documentation up to date for each of them of how you use it, some examples, that sort of thing.
For my company, we're a small company, so our documentation is pretty much our unit tests.
At least you have tests written first. That's awesome.
Yeah, we strive for
Actually,
close to 100%.
Wait, actually, that's another great area of discussion, Wesley. And I'm curious. Let's talk about testing for a second, because typically testing for UI is tougher than for services where you can just straight use Mocha and you don't need to necessarily fire up a browser or Phantom.js or whatever. So rely mostly on like Karma or Protractor, like end-to-end testing. What's your strategy for testing your components?
I mean, for us, we try to do as much as we can using like actual browser interactions. Unfortunately, we use Phantom.js, and we actually run into some limitations of Phantom, unfortunately, when it comes to that, because, for example, if you try to instantiate a new keyboard event, Phantom.js is not happy about that, for example. So for us, it does create some challenges, and we have to push that off more to our integration level testing with Selenium. If that got cut off, I muted myself by accident.
Yeah, testing is interesting. So we know on the platform we want to have good unit tests with our components that people are going to reuse. So it's one less thing they have to worry about. That component's going to be well tested. Kind of one of the benefits of the platform. But on the app level, we push everybody to do real end-to-end and stress tests through the API. And for the UI, since it can be a little bit more fragile in those long-running tests, we try to do kind of functional flow end-to-end tests with the UI, right? So fire up a thing and do several steps until you save the item and you see it's completed and all those kind of good things. So yeah, we use just the Karma built in with ng for the ng test, and we use Protractor. And with Angular 2, it's surely just a tiny layer compared to Angular 1 for Protractor to Selenium. So we've got good QA teams writing tests for that and constantly ticking off the UI developers finding bugs.
Do you guys find that you have to kind of pick and choose the level of detail that you go into your UI testing versus, say, like a unit test? What I mean by that is, you think about a unit test and you're covering some logic, right? Business logic. And you're like, I want to ensure that this is going to do X, Y, Z all the time, and that any code changes don't break that. And that seems super important. And the UI is important as well, but the UI seems like it's something that's more fluid, that over time you're like, oh, I want to tweak this and maybe make this expand and contract instead of doing this. And how do you decide, okay, yeah, should we write a UI test for that? Or is that just kind of something that maybe will change and it's not worth curating over time, the time you might put into it to just confirm that that's still working, that sort of thing?
Actually, this is what I really miss in Angular 2 at the moment, because a while ago, for example, for .NET, there are tools which allows you to write tests in BDD style and express the happy flow, like business value. You can express the business value in a text, and then just repeat this test from time to time. More of that, whatever. If you will even change your UI look and feel, you'll still be able to check the business value stuff, just fixing a bit kind of selectors, like what does this button really means from text? Like, okay, go to the next page, and then you're just changing how to implement it in your test suite. This is what I really missing right at the moment for Angular 2, because unit test is nice, but they are for developers initially. End-to-end tests usually written like, okay, we have those buttons on this page, and they seems to be working, but really nobody cares about like semicolons or like stubs with spaces. Same about end-to-end tests when you sell a project, and you should be able to respond to your customer actually at any point. Does his happy flow is working or not? So if I suppose soon we will have this tool back working again with Angular 2, and we'll be lucky to write like happy flow testing with BDD style, and it will be just awesome, hopefully.
Yeah, we really rely heavily on those kind of happy flow, business critical end-to-end tests with our stuff. And it's not just for the UI developers, right? So it's also, we have a whole test suite that runs and kicks off with any build. So when they change something on the API level, they'll see if they broke something also with our end-to-end test, because it uses the API. So it kind of helps all the teams. The other good thing I like about end-to-end test is we use Sauce Labs for trying all the different OS and browser flavors too. So we just develop in Chrome on a daily basis. So it's really good for us to see if things are actually working in an end-to-end test for our browsers. And the way that we do it with the UI constantly changing is we add IDs on elements for our QA people. And we don't use IDs for anything but that anymore in the web. So we know if there's an ID on something, it's an important element that if you're going to change it, make sure you keep the ID.
Does that get sketchy a bit when you don't know what's the composition of the entire app running at any given moment is, and ID collision? I mean, have you run into that a lot, or is it really kind of?
We don't run into collisions, but we need to be aware of it, because we constantly break things accidentally from the end-to-end test, and the QA team isn't happy with us. So we're just aware of it. You see an ID, be careful.
Okay, I have this constant fight with my testing engineers about not any ID in my application, never. Then I had to explain them what is component selector, and you can look on the component selector and then build your path inside of it, and then we got just fine, because component selectors usually does not change so often. So, but this fight, no IDs in my application, it's reusable.
They feel dirty. Yeah, the constructors work great, and our team jump on those quick. But sometimes, man, I just want to call it out just so we make sure not to screw that one thing up.
Well, one aspect of this that I may be missing, this may be a dumb question, but so in your UI library, like you're developing a component without the context of like the entire page. So if you're using Protractor to do end-to-end testing, you have to kind of point it somewhere to actually run that. And unless I haven't done this enough with Angular 2, but do you have to like build in your library sort of like the context for testing so that the component like lives page so that you can actually test it? How does that work?
Add samples to your documentation and test your documentation. Why not? You have all needed samples, and you can test 2 pluses in 1. You test in your documentation, and you're testing your components via end-to-end.
Oh, so you're saying you have a web page that's your documentation, Dimitri, and you put your components on there? Yeah, gotcha. That's interesting. Do you guys follow some similar approach, or what do you do, Kyle?
Yeah, well, from what I understand with the question, I think we have our unit testing for the components that we're responsible for, but they still include unit testing for the things they write within the custom app using our UI platform.
Okay.
Then they did end on the app. Sorry.
Gotcha. You don't do the end-to-end testing on the library itself. You do it within the context of the larger app. I gotcha.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Now, one thing that I guess I'll just plug here that is possible that I've started to do, that it's a little bit more complicated to set up at first. I should maybe publish a gist on this or something. But using Angular Universal, the library that I maintain for Angular 2 to do server rendering, you actually can do some testing without a browser, so that it's only for certain types of tests, like, and it's only testing certain types of things. You wouldn't want to use it for everything, but it is possible to, if you use something like Redux, where you have like, you're defining your state outside the component, and you then run, you define your state, and then you create like a fake bootstrap, testing bootstrap, and use Angular Universal to generate the HTML, and then like actually run tests to basically what you're testing then is just like comparing expected HTML to HTML is. So you can do that even without, you know, a browser context and firing up like Chrome or Phantom or whatever else. So I found that a little bit useful in certain use cases for certain types of things. But anyway, okay. So we're getting near the end of our time here. I guess the last question that I had is, what, Kyle, what is on your wish list to, like, just in terms of capabilities and features of you know, Angular 2 for creating UI libraries? You know, we talked about some of the challenges for in different areas. If you could have one, you know, wish, or maybe a couple, of things that you would like to see change, or new things kind of built so to make your life easier as a UI component developer, what would some of those be?
So my biggest wish, I guess, isn't directly related to building like a component library, but just in general for prototyping, because I kind of design and code. I don't really use Sketch or anything. So for quick prototyping, the biggest pain point for me now in Angular 2 is when I want to create like a new view. I wish the ng generate route thing would do everything magically for me, because I've got to create the new view and the exports, and then I've got to import that in the modules, and then I've got to import that in the routes, and then I've got to define those routes in navigation. So I need like a one-click generate a new view and auto-populate all these files for me, because I feel like it takes 10 minutes every time I want to create a new view just to go update all the same place and copy and paste. The other thing is some of the missing kind of parameters that you used to be able to do, like on in Angular 1 with the UI router for like the page titles and stuff like that, just adding different parameters onto the routes. There's ways to do that in Angular 2 right now, but it's kind of painful. So all my pain is generated from the routes.
I wish the Angular CLI had a nice way to publish your modules. Like
yes, dude, yeah.
because that is such a huge pain in the, well, it's just a huge pain currently.
We will have to edit.
No, that's actually a good idea. Wesley, did you ever submit that kind of feature request, or talk to Mike Brocky about that?
No, I actually just like realized that just an hour ago.
No, I realized a bit longer ago, but you know, it's there are too much ways to build the same stuff, and even inside of the Angular teams, there still goes discussion: should we build with Clojure, with Rollup, with Webpack, or with something else? So how we'll place all that stuff inside of the bundle you do? Like, will it be UMD in the main field? Like, and all that stuff. It's still warm to, you know, it's still too much fresh to say like we should do it some kind of way. But it would be really nice. Just have not only application inside of Angular, but modules, bundles, awesome.
Like the reason I say this also is just because I feel like it would also help the ecosystem a lot more, because if the barrier is lowered in terms of publishing your plugins, then more people are likely to do so, and we'll have a better third-party ecosystem.
Well, I'm sure that Mike is listening now, or he'll watch this show afterwards, and he'll have this done by next seeing So we look forward to seeing the next version of the Angular CLI with the feature. You've heard it here first, to be able to publish your UI component library, which will be awesome. Thanks, Wesley, for that idea. All right. And actually, I do have one myself. You know, I like SCSS, SAS. You know, I definitely like the fact that the Shadow DOM emulation in Angular 2, there's for sure certain things that are nice for styles with a lot of the new stuff that's coming out. But still, I've always felt that, like when, certain JavaScript libraries come out that like you just, oh, this is it. This is like, some people feel that way about like Webpack, that like they love Webpack so much that this is the answer to like everything. Or, some of the React people feel that about React or whatever else. I've never gotten that feeling from any CSS related technology out there, even if there's like slight improvements or whatever. So I guess my biggest hope is that somehow in the next 10 years, we'll probably have like an intelligent robot that can do everything for you, but we'll still be struggling with the best way to handle styles efficiently and everything. So if anybody with the React or Angular 2 of the CSS world, that'll be the accomplishment of the century, I guess.
Styles and package managers. I can't believe we haven't talked about Yarn yet.
All right, so yeah. I have a wish list, and mine is to be able to set view encapsulation as well as change detection globally for your app or your module, whatever, so that every time I create new components throughout this thing, I don't have to set that in my metadata for my components. So I wish I'd have a way to do that. I mean, that could be something that could go into the CLI as well with a little configuration and say, hey, generate all my new components with this strategy for these two things. So maybe Mike could throw that in there as well.
Yeah. We'll have a whole list from it. You might as well solve the CSS thing too. Mike, get on the CSS thing as well.
Okay, Mike.
Cool.
Yeah, Mike, make a comment, ng, make it pretty.
All right,
Sure.
On that note, let's go to wrap up the show with our picks for today. And Wesley, why don't you start off with your pick?
Okay, yeah. I mean, these aren't particularly new articles or links, but I have one link here for the explanation about how change detection works in Angular 2. I found it, I mean, I've read it before, but I found it a nice read again, especially since I plugged it into my app today. And the other two...
That one, Wesley, is from the Thought Ram blog. I especially love, I read that one, and it's really good. And I especially love that they keep their blog articles up to date. So they'll constantly update it as the system changes. So definitely, yeah, I agree. Definitely check that out.
And those guys are very knowledgeable about Angular. I mean, Pascal and Christoph, I mean, they know their stuff. And the other two links I linked here is for about AOT compilation for Webpack. So like I linked the npm module for that, as well as an example app that has it wired up already, so that you're not fumbling around, because the documentation is very thin currently.
Cool. Thanks, Wesley. Dimitri, how about you?
So my picks will be not so much about, but I have to right now, after you said about Sugram, I have to add ngBook, because they're struggling with Angular 2 for, I'm already reading it for like several months. So, and they started at alpha, and they're still keeping it up to date, and I'm using it to teach someone, and it's really great. Other thing that is over me this week is not so much a pick, but this product we do. It's non-profit educational project Taylor Street, and we just released a couple of days ago. It's written with Angular 2, and we even had Reddit Hugs of Death, so it was more than 100,000 customers, like visitors unique per 1 hour. It was like a pain, so this is why I look so sleepy. But it's a great product to check how people live in all the world and compare their income levels, and see how people live around the world.
Very cool. I like that. Thanks, Dimitri. Justin.
Yeah, so one pick that's an example of a component library, Olivier Combs' ng2-translate. I might have mentioned it before as a pick, but that's a good example of seeing how you could set up a project, how you could do the NPM publish and stuff like that. It kind of has all that in there. So check out that library if you're looking for a place to get started with instructions on how to do that. I mean, it's good example code. And then I got a bunch of game picks today. Civilization 6 comes out midnight tonight, so that's pretty pumped about that. Red Dead Redemption 2 was announced, one of my favorite series, so that's pretty cool. And then the Nintendo Switch got announced today, and details on that. So I'm an avid gamer, getting on that.
Beware of Civilization if you care about productivity.
Yes, very much. Just one more turn, right?
Nice. Kyle.
Yeah, so my shameless plug is for Covalent. GetCovalent.com is the UI library. And the name, while building on atomic design, is actually also kind of a dig at Ionic, because while they're attacking the mobile for Angular, we're really trying to attack the desktop enterprise. We want to give you everything you need on the desktop apps. Besides that, the fun stuff are the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 trailer came out. I get my Google Pixel phone tomorrow, so I'm changing over from longtime iPhone user to the Pixel. And Battlefield 1 comes out tomorrow, so some fun stuff for the weekend.
We're all gonna have a productivity drop over this next couple of weeks.
So holiday season's on us, man, with those games and movies.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Definitely. All right, so a couple quick notes. Next Tuesday, or this upcoming Tuesday rather, we're going to do a show about Angular in the enterprise. We have a couple, from bigger enterprises. I've worked at a larger company. A couple of people on the panel have, so we're going to have a really good discussion about introducing new technologies and the politics involved there, and how to get everybody's buy-in and kind of spreading, that type of thing. And then in 2 weeks, I'm really excited that we're going to have Kara Erickson on to talk about Angular Material, actually, which is related to our discussion topic today. So that's going to be super exciting. And from my picks today, I have two. So one is to check out the